the session so that we can share it widely with everyone who's here and those who couldn't attend this workshop. So my name is Aurélie Kalenga. I am from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I'm the Communications Manager here at the African Climate Reality Project, ACRP in short. Our head office is in South Africa, Johannesburg to be specific, and we are hosted by Food and Trees for Africa. And I know we have a number of climate reality leaders on this call, but for those who we haven't worked with before and who don't really know what we do and who we are essentially the Africa branch of the international organization Climate Reality Project. We're founded by the former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, and we work with NGOs, with community-based organizations and activists from across the continent to create resources and provide support to advance the climate justice movement with a solution-based perspective. So our two focus areas are public finance and climate literacy and awareness. And through these programs, we really want to use education, mobilization, and advocacy to influence the relevant institutions to deal with the climate crisis, advancing climate justice objectives. So these workshops that we'll be having, the African Voices workshop series, they'll form part of the climate literacy and awareness campaign. And the goal here is to see increased climate literacy, particularly of indigenous and local practices, leading to more climate action and adaptation responses across Africa, particularly amongst groups with the least adaptive capacity. And really, we aim to do this by hosting and facilitating these kinds of workshops related to climate change, climate literacy and education, and adaptation action. So this is really, to support each other, to support you all with the knowledge and the resources to train people in your communities, your regions, your countries to run adaptation projects, that fit into your community and that really fill that gap that's in your own community so that together we can build the Africa we want. And this is particularly important for us as Africans because many surveys have shown that the average national climate literacy rate across the continent is between 28 and 35%, compared to Europe and North America, where some countries there are at over 80%. And more alarming is that on average, the climate literacy rate amongst rural women on the continent is around 12% lower than men. So education has been proven to be an effective path to climate literacy in Africa. And this is why we launched the African Voices Workshop series. To support the increase of climate literacy, we'll be running these 2-hour educational workshops every month between June and August. We'll have various experts come in to speak about Climate Change 101 and adaptation projects, focusing on water security, on waste management, and today's topic on food sovereignty. And we've chosen to educate through food sovereignty because it's an important tool to shift power dynamics in the food system, specifically building communities' capacity at the local level to create decentralized food systems that address hunger and food insecurity. Building food sovereignty using sustainable approaches can help strengthen people's ability to respond to shocks. And given the changing climate and weather patterns like El Nino, the droughts that we're seeing in East Africa, the flooding that we had here in South Africa, as well as in the Congo, in Rwanda, and subsequent lower yields in some areas, there's evidence that food sovereignty builds resilience for small-scale farmers to adapt and become more resilient to extreme conditions through indigenous methods of farming. So we're really excited to take you through the theory and the implementation of food sovereignty with 2 experts here today. We have Vanessa Black. She completed a Bachelor of Architecture degree at Wits University and worked briefly as an architect before following her passion for environmental justice. She worked in various civil society organizations and in 2017 joined Biowatch South Africa as the Advocacy, Research and Policy Co-ordinator. Biowatch supports smallholder farmers. It works with civil society organizations and engages decision makers to challenge the industrialized food system and demonstrates agroecology as a means of ensuring biodiversity while attaining food and seed sovereignty and social justice. Rogan Field is also one of our experts today. He's also our colleague here at Food and Trees for Africa. He manages the procurement office, and issues like social inequality, education, food security, and environmental sustainability are really close to his heart. And he believes that through education and collaboration, we can make a difference. You'll see a bit later that we've also integrated an art session into the workshop, which will serve as an exercise to really reflect and process emotions surrounding climate change through writing or of poetry or drawing, or, just a word that really describes, how you feel about climate change and your own lived experiences. Ziyanda Nkumane will take us through that process. Ziyanda is also a colleague of ours from ACRP. She is the Community Engagement Coordinator. The CRL who are on this call will be very familiar with Ziyanda. And at the end of the call, I'll be announcing a very exciting opportunity for CRLs who are here today. But before we get into all of that, it's important to first give you the basics of climate change through our Climate 101 presentation. And Courtney Morgan will lead the session. She's a campaigner here at ACRP. Over to you, Courts.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Aurelie, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here so you can let me know. Can you all see that?
Oh, good.
Yes.
Awesome, thanks. Hi, everybody. It's so great to start off our workshop series today. This is just a Climate 101 and how to take action. We're hoping that through these workshops, we can really build climate literacy. We will be, straight after my presentation, going on to Vanessa's and then Rogan's, and then we'll have a Q&A and a discussion after that. So firstly, let's start with the definition, right? So climate change is the measured increase in global average temperatures, which is human-induced. It's very important to remember a couple of words that are very important, in this definition. So firstly, remember that it is measured, which means that this is a definition that is based in science. It comes out of scientific data over many, many, many years. And then you also have global, which means that yes, different countries are heating at different rates, but all in all, this is a global phenomenon. And then average is very important, which means that even though we still have some cold days, this doesn't mean we're not experiencing climate change. It just means that the average temperature over a year has shown us that we are getting hotter. And of course, very important to say that this is human induced. Although a change in climate over millions of years is a natural process that the Earth goes through, humans have accelerated this process. And I think this is kind of, there are a couple of vital facts that you can speak about depending on what's relevant to your community. So for example, Southern Africa, we speak about as a climate hotspot, which means that both geographically and socioeconomically, we are extra vulnerable to climate change. Some regions in Southern Africa are heating at double the global average. We also, many countries across Africa do not have the socioeconomic stability to be able to bounce back from extreme weather events and the impacts of climate change. We also talk about climate change as a threat multiplier, which means that any challenge that your community is experiencing, climate change will often exacerbate or multiply that challenge. So for example, if you are already experiencing hunger, which a lot of people across the continent are, climate change induced droughts will make growing food even more difficult and thus making hunger more widespread. We also know that climate change is an issue, a gendered issue. We know that women are 14% more likely to die in a climate event. So these are just a couple of facts. But I think the biggest thing in the space is that we use a lot of terms and we use a lot of jargon. So this presentation will really go through some of the misconceptions and some of the terms that we need to understand in order to work and take action in the space. So the first misconception is the difference between climate and weather. So weather is firstly the state of the atmosphere at any particular place and time. So for example, we can say that the weather today is that it's raining, that it is cloudy in Johannesburg today. Whereas climate, on the other hand, is weather conditions prevailing in an area over a longer period of time. So this is your weather patterns in a particular place. So your climate is more around, you can say the climate of Cameroon is tropical. Just an example, right? Another misconception is the difference between global warming and climate change. A lot of people use this term interchangeably, but there is slight difference and slight nuance that we need to understand. So just to clarify, global warming is the gradual increase of the Earth's surface temperature. So when we talk about the temperature increase in the world due to the greenhouse effect, that is global warming. Climate change then is more a bit nuanced. It is the impacts and the changes in weather patterns we see due to, among other things, global warming. So the temperatures are increasing and therefore there are knock-on effects, which we'll talk about a bit later in the presentation. So climate change is more the long-term change in the weather patterns. As I said, climate change is something that is human-induced. And I think it's really important to understand where we've come from and how we got here. So the first thing to say is that climate change is a result of the burning of fossil fuels, right? Which started really during the Industrial Revolution with the invention of the coal-fired steam engine. So essentially, the Industrial Revolution was a move from a human economy to machinery. So what that means is that instead of having humans producing goods, we move to machinery producing goods in factories, which if you ever see pictures of the Industrial Revolution, you'll see these massive factories with all of this black smoke. That is the burning of coal for heat and for energy. So obviously these big factories the machinery in them required energy, and that's why we started burning coal. And very important, when I say we, I mean the North. It's really important to look at climate change as a justice issue as well. So when I talk about the Industrial Revolution, this is really something that happened in the North, and it really pushed forward their development trajectory. And then a couple of other things that also, have us in this climate crisis is that as a result of the increased development, we also then had to increase urbanization, which meant that there was a lot of deforestation that happened, which of course takes away our carbon sinks. So trees take out the carbon from our atmosphere, and we are cutting them down to build more houses, to build massive commercial agriculture, and those massive commercial farms also emit a lot, but they also take away land from forests, for forests. So that is essentially where we are. So before we continue, I know that I've kind of been saying fossil fuels. I think it's important, again, that we clarify a lot of the terms that we use that maybe, we kind of assume everyone understands. So the first term is, what is a fossil fuel, right? And it's in the name, but essentially these are fuels that form over millions of years from decaying organic material. So these are dead animals, dead plants that have been fossilized over millions of years, and basically they have been exposed to heat and to pressure, and they become coal, oil, or gas. Essentially, this is concentrated carbon that has been stored in our earth and our ocean beds. Now, what do we do to this concentrated carbon? We dig it up and we burn it for energy, and we release all of that concentrated stored carbon back into the atmosphere, which disrupts the carbon cycle and causes the greenhouse effect, which is what we'll talk about next. So yeah, so it's very important to understand why are these emissions such a massive problem, right? So, and what is happening in the Earth systems for us to result in a climate crisis. So the first thing is obviously the greenhouse effect, which I think most people in this call will be familiar with, but just if you're hearing it for the first time, what happens is that what we call greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, methane, which already exist in our atmosphere anyway, what we're doing is that we're burning too much of it, emitting too much of it, and it essentially creates a blanket around the Earth. We already have an atmosphere that has a very delicate balance of allowing some of the sun's rays to come in and then allowing some of them to release. What we've done by creating the greenhouse effect is that a lot of the sun's energy is being trapped in our atmosphere and then gets reflected back onto the Earth, which results in the heating of our oceans and our land surfaces. And that's essentially when we talk about global warming. But then there's all of these knock-on effects that you get from the heating of the oceans and of the land, which is the image down below. And you'll see that there are a couple of indicators, right? So you have glaciers melting, you have less snow cover on mountains, you have your land getting hotter, you have sea surface temperature getting warmer, and you have the melting of your sea ice, right? All of these things have knock-on effects and change the systems and the flows of how our Earth works. For example, sea level rise means that a lot of our coastal, our island states are in jeopardy of not existing in, over the years if we continue to emit the way that we do. There are other indicators. So sea level rise is one, melting glaciers, but you also have biodiversity loss due to plants and animals not being able to adapt as fast as the changes are coming. And then you also have increased extreme weather, right? So this is getting very geographical. We don't have to, all of us don't have to know this, but essentially when you have different temperatures over the ocean, you have different pressure systems forming at different strengths. And so we have all of these massive storms that are coming, causing floods. We also have some regions going to experience extreme drought due to climate change. So these are all due to us emitting and systems essentially changing. That is a very, very quick summary of climate change. And the next thing that we need to talk about is we really believe that we need action, and we believe that action is only achieved through education. So that's why we do these workshops. We need action at every level, right? So there's individual action, there's systemic action, there's national action. I think somebody's unmuted. If one of my colleagues can just help to mute people. So how do we take action? There's a couple of things that we can do. And there's a couple of international actions that are taking place and that we need to kind of be aware of, right? This also comes with definitions. So the first kind of action that we do is mitigation, right? So these are, So mitigation refers to efforts or actions to reduce or prevent emissions of greenhouse gases. So that is fundamentally about trying to address the climate crisis, so trying to stop emissions and reduce the effects of climate change. The biggest example of mitigation is the move to renewable energy, right? Then you have adaptation as an action, and that's the focus of this webinar series that we're hosting. Adaptation can be defined as adjustments to a system to reduce the vulnerability to climate change. So this is about impact. As we know, climate change is already here. This is about dealing with the impacts that we are already feeling. So for example, a climate-induced drought or flooding, there are ways to adapt or adjust how we live, so our behavior or our infrastructure to deal with that so that we don't experience loss of life. So for example, planting resilient food in a small-scale community garden can help adapt to a drought, for example. So what's important to remember here is that mitigation is about cause, adaptation is about impact. The next kind of action that we have really been involved in with as ACRP is loss and damage. So this is something that you would have really heard a lot coming out of COP27, because it is something that is really being called on by the Global South. So loss and damage is essentially the impact of climate-related stresses that occur despite efforts to reduce greenhouse gases and adapt to climate change. So these are basically events that happen where adaptation and mitigation have not resulted in reduced vulnerability. So in the Global South, we are really calling for loss and damage financing, because there are cases already taking place that have resulted in a loss of life and a damage to infrastructure that would have really benefited from more immediate relief and more immediate action, where adaptation and mitigation have not assisted, right? So you have the floods in Pakistan, the floods in Rwanda, floods in KZN, South Africa. All of these are what we're calling loss and damage events. And then just two more terms that we'll speak about. And you may hear us talking about this quite a lot going forward. But essentially, as ACRP, we really use justice as the thread to bring all of our work together. And that's really important because we really see climate change as an issue of justice, an issue of human rights, a gendered issue, and something not just about the environment. So the first term is a just transition, and this is a term that comes out of unions, and it just describes a shift from high carbon economy to low carbon economy with nobody left behind. And what this means is that justice is at the center, and a just transition calls for workers and communities to be protected in the transition. So we don't just remove a coal mine and add a solar farm and that's a just transition. We really are calling for the reskilling and the social protection of those workers who will be negatively affected by the transition, and communities who currently are reliant on the harmful industries. We need to make sure that they are taken care of as we transition. The second one then is climate justice. A lot of people on this call would call themselves climate justice activists. And this is really something that we use at ACRP as well. This is essentially the concept that those who are affected first and those who are affected most severely by climate change are the least responsible for the crisis. I'll show you a map next where it really illustrates what we're talking about. It also recognizes that the impacts of climate change and the burden of impacts of mitigation fall on the most vulnerable. So not only are the extreme weather events from climate change affecting the poor and the most vulnerable first and most severely, also in our mitigation efforts, we are also putting that burden on those who are most vulnerable in our society. Climate justice says that we need to remedy that fact. So I'm going to illustrate how we talk about climate change and how we talk about it in a justice perspective, right? So this is, if you look at these two pictures, they are both telling the same story, but in very different ways, right? So as you can see, both are telling us, yes, we've been emitting since 1850 as the entire world, and that's just a fact. But if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, that is just how much we have emitted over the years, right? And you can see the drastic increase, and that's a fact. Then you look at the map, which tells the same story. It tells us how much we've emitted, but now it tells you who has emitted. And as you can see, it's Europe, it's North America, it's also South Africa, but essentially it is the global North who have done the most emitting, right? So this is why we talk about this as a justice issue, is because we know that Africa experienced a lot of the impacts, doesn't have the socioeconomic conditions to bounce back, yet most African countries have had little to no contribution to the climate crisis. So this is why it's important to reflect data in a very relevant and accessible way, as opposed to just saying, we're in this crisis because we've emitted too many fossil fuels. I'm just going to mute, sorry. Again, sticking with the justice aspect, it's also true that a lot of people in Africa do not have the privilege of just caring about temperature increase. We need to know, how is this really affecting people on the ground? And this is how we communicate the climate crisis in a way that really means something to people. And what we mean by this is that we have to speak about climate change in what we call bread and butter issues. So it's not just an issue that's affecting our environment. This is why we say climate justice activism. We don't only care about the environment, but we care about the socioeconomic issues. And this is why we have to explain it in a way that speaks to people's lived experience. So for example, climate change causes food price increases. If the climate is changing and the rains are not coming like they used to, that is going to impact the way people grow food. So not only at the local level, but also at the global level. The crop yields are not going to be as high, and you're going to have various things that impact how people grow food. And if there's a scarcity, that means the prices go up. You also have, for example, resource conflict. You have massive lakes across Africa that used to span 4 or 5 countries that now only span 2 or 3 countries. What are those communities doing that now have to cross a borderline to access water that they've always accessed? These are issues that arise that are lived experience and not just about the temperature increase. You then have, and I just have 2 more slides, so I'll be done in about 5 minutes. You then have something that is very important to us at ACRP and really important to us as Africans. And essentially because we have for centuries kept our cultures and traditions alive through storytelling. We have a very rich history of oral tradition in Africa. What this means is that we don't all have to understand the science or know the carbon cycle and explain climate change in this very technical way. But what we can do and what we can all do is tell a story. And this is how people will really relate to the crisis. So you can tell the story of various activists and various communities who started to stand up and say no to mining due to the effects that they felt. For example, Ewi from Cameroon, who's one of our climate leaders, who really has used her platform to encourage the government and encourage communities to plant more trees, and has created an opportunity for employment for women in her community. There are so many stories that communities themselves can tell about why they choose to act on climate. You have communities who are riddled with cancers and respiratory issues due to being surrounded by petrochemical plants or living right next to a mine. All of these things are stories that will really hit home for people. And that's really how we communicate the climate crisis at ACRP as well. So, of course, these that I've been speaking about, speaking about climate as a justice issue, speaking about the bread and butter issues, telling stories, all of these things are really what you can do at the individual level, at the community level, at your organizational level. But there are also systemic issues and systemic ways that we have to act. And we know that in order to really achieve justice, we need systemic change. And my last slide is just a crash course on some of the institutions that are important that maybe you hear about in the space, but you don't really know what they do or who they are. So first, you've got the IPCC, that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is essentially a body of the UN, and their goal is to expand knowledge. They're kind of like the research wing of the UN. So if we ever talk about the 1.5 degree versus the 2 degree scenario, this comes out of a special report done by the IPCC. So when you talk about research, like the latest research on climate change, it usually will be coming out of the IPCC. You then have the SDGs, which are the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are basically universal goals to address multiple crises that the world is experiencing. And just so it's gender equality, better education, and climate change is just one of those 17, it's number 13. They were adopted in 2015 and essentially have the goal of 2030 to address these crises. You then have the G20, which is a group of the 20 world's largest economies. It's basically where we discuss international economic cooperation. They have a specific working group on climate change and the economic implications. It's really important to look at some of the negotiations that come out of the G20, keeping in mind that next year the presidency sits with Brazil under a leftist government, and the following year it sits with South Africa. And then lastly, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the UNFCCC, which is an international treaty that recognizes that there was a need to stop emissions and to address the coming climate crisis. Those countries who have signed onto this treaty are what we call parties, and they meet at COP every year, which stands for the Conference of the Parties. So usually this is where you have your landmark agreements. If we talk about the Paris Agreement, these are basically the binding agreements that come out of the various COPs. Of course, we know that not all of us have the privilege to have access to these spaces. So when we talk about international institutions, it's really important to always link that with local action and local knowledge, and really call for systemic change globally. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that was helpful. If there are any questions, we can go to them at the end. But for now, I want to hand over to Vanessa, who's going to take us through some of the theory and concepts around food sovereignty. Thanks, Vanessa.
Yeah, let me just... Sorry, can you see my screen?
Yeah, perfectly. Thanks, Vanessa.
All right. Thank you for having me. So I was asked to speak about food sovereignty and the history of food sovereignty. And so I'm going to also tell a little bit of a story about how that came about. Sorry, let me just... So just starting with another, the sort of precondition around which the whole dialogue on food sovereignty, or the campaign on food sovereignty, started was fluctuations in world food prices. And as a consequence, more and more people going hungry because they can't access food. And we've had the Food and Agricultural Organization, which oversees issues around food globally. It's also a UN body. And in 1993, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization elected a new president. And he was the first African president that the Food and Agricultural Organization had, called Jacques Diouf from Senegal. Probably I'm pronouncing that wrong. But he decided that he'd been mandated to make reforms in the Food and Agricultural Organization. And he decided that given the problems that were happening around food prices, hunger, etc., that World Food Summit should be called in Rome. And that happened in 1996. And the holding of the Food Summit, I think it was the first big one after the 1970s food crises. It drew a huge number of social movements to Rome who organized a counter summit at the same time that the heads of state were meeting. And it was led by huge social movements like La Via Campesina, which had formed in 1993, and others from all around the world, consisting of food producers from the ground, small farmers, small fishers, indigenous people, who all came together to talk about the food crises that people were seeing and the problems in the food system. And social movements really disagreed in a way with what was happening at the official food FAO World Food Summit meeting. So a whole lot of good things came out. On the official side, despite the criticism, what was good is that the meeting formally adopted the right to food, the right to adequate food. The right to food had existed before. It had been incorporated into human rights many years before, but the meeting of heads of state really committed to do something to enable the right to food globally. And it also updated the definition of food security. But social movements said that was not enough, that we need the right to food, but food security isn't enough of isn't enough to address the issues around access to food and hunger and what were the underlying structural causes of food insecurity globally. And just to, as part of that mobilizing, they had a coordinating committee, and that coordinating committee really said that the people who really produce food needed to be at the forefront of decisions about food and needed to share what was happening on the ground. And so they came up with a really historical statement or a historical document to counter the concept of food security, saying that it was inadequate to address worsening global hunger. And particularly because of the operations of transnational corporations, these big corporations that were in the food system and were getting increasing control over the food system, and then also free trade agreements that were undermining national sovereignty and national decision-making around food and how food was accessed and produced. So just on the screen is this beautiful set of postcards that were made to commemorate looking back at that 1996 meeting and the declarations that came out from civil society around that time. And the core message was that people want a future without hunger, and that required agrarian reform. It required us to protect natural resources. It required social peace. So a lot of the food insecurity in the world is also related to conflict around the world and people caught up in conflicts. And I think this is really relevant because we're seeing more and more conflict, as Courtney mentioned, with climate change. And whole regions in extreme food insecurity, and of course the war in Ukraine, which has had a knock-on impact in our food system recently. And to have those things, one needs democratic control, and then underpinning all of that is food as a basic human right. So those gathered social movements put out this statement, and this is just an excerpt from it, saying, do we want profit for few or food for all? And they were talking to the globalization of the world economy that had happened, along with a lack of accountability of these transnational corporations. And as a consequence, this global economy and a globalized economy that's characterized by unemployment, low wages, bankruptcy of family farmers, the undermining of small producers on every level, the destruction of rural economies as a consequence, and then the sort of forced relocation of people who worked the land or were on the land into cities. The increasing industrialization of agriculture that was destroying traditional farming, but also has a huge number of knock-on impacts, poisoning the planet, and as I'll show just now, a huge impact on the climate. And then that this was all also being impacted because wealthy nations were subsidizing their food producers and were exporting, and then were dumping food at low prices that undermined the ability of local producers to produce. And all those things, I think what's disconcerting for me is that they're still all very relevant in today's food system. So the social movements were saying that we need another model for achieving food security that looks at these structural issues, that's based on decentralization and challenges all these concentrations of power that threaten our food security and our planetary systems. And what they proposed then was an alternative concept of food sovereignty. But just to look at the definition of food security, so this is the definition that we're all familiar with now, is that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And it sounds pretty good on the face of it, but what it doesn't do is doesn't challenge the power relations that underlie the problems that we're seeing in the food system. It doesn't address issues around access, really. So, for example, why I'm saying that is that in South Africa, we are food secure in terms of per person. We have enough food. In fact, we produce 120% of the food requirements of South Africans. But the reality is a third of South Africans are food insecure in some way or another, mostly because people can't access that food. It's sitting in supermarkets, but if you don't have money, you can't buy it. And if you don't have land and resources to produce, you can't produce your own food. So food security is not addressing real food needs. And so social movements suggested or proposed this other alternative conception of the food system based on food sovereignty, which is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agricultural systems. Just to say that this definition actually comes from another big meeting that happened a few years later in Mali, and it's called the Nieleni Declaration on Food Sovereignty, that brought all the social movements together. And at that meeting, they unpacked more of what is meant by food sovereignty and what we all need to do to attain food sovereignty and the key pillars that underpin it. I also just want to mention that arising out of that 1996 World Food Summit, it was really groundbreaking in that it gave rise to a whole lot of international civil society institutions. So one called the IPC, so not to be confused with the Climate Convention, IPCC, but the IPC is the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, which is a network of big social movement networks that then got together to strategize how to get food sovereignty and the right to food and other rights for people that are living in rural areas into international law and policy. And so there's been campaigns to influence, for example, the Committee on World Food Security, which was restructured in 2010 and is the only UN body, although it's not linked to a treaty, but it makes sort of guideline policies. And that's the only UN body where civil society has a direct voice, a seat on it, and can organize to put forward views. And IPC's intervened in all sorts of fora to put forward this concept of food sovereignty and try and get more rights for people who actually produce food. Also just noting that 70% of world food is actually produced by small producers, but small producers just aren't recognized and aren't supported and are constantly under threat. So looking at food sovereignty, here are the pillars of food sovereignty that social movements have put forward. So the first is that it must value the actual providers of food. So the small scale fishers, indigenous peoples, pastoralists, and people working the land. And that also includes informal workers on the land. We must localize food systems. We need to put control locally. We need to build our knowledge and skills as food providers. And fundamentally to that was rejecting technologies like genetic modification that undermine our food systems and threaten and contaminate them, but also put more control into the hands of multinationals. And we need to work with nature, there's another pillar. And in that, it's really agroecology is the way that is being proposed to give to be the way to achieve food sovereignty. And then it must focus on food for people fundamentally. And I think that's a big problem also in our policies, that they're very much focused on massifying, putting people together and to get people to produce for international value chains, and concentrating on export, on cash crops, and not fundamentally on food for people. So those were the 6 main pillars of food sovereignty proposed by social movements. So as I mentioned, agroecology is the main element that is used in the construction of food sovereignty on a practical level. And there's both the Nyeleni Declaration on food sovereignty and the Nyeleni Declaration on Agroecology, which came in 2015. They're both much longer documents, and I'd really encourage you to download them and look at them, because they're really instructive and useful inspiration for how we think about what we do. But I've just taken little bits out of it. So again, focusing on small producers across all different kinds of food production. It also speaks to agroecology being political, because it requires us to challenge and transform these structures of power in society. And so to enable us to take back control of all the resources we need for food production, including seed, the biodiversity, which we depend on, the land, our territory's water, and also knowledge and culture. It also speaks to both the food sovereignty declarations and the agroecology one, speak very much to the central role of women as key holders of many things, and actors who just don't get the support and are constantly undermined and bear the brunt of all the negative impacts of the globalized industrialized food system. So just to share a little bit, I know we're going to go on to a presentation about starting your own food garden, but these are some images from where we work as Biowatch in KwaZulu-Natal, in the very north of northeastern side of South Africa. And these are some of the components of the practice of agroecology. So it starts with building healthy soil, healthy ecosystems, not killing pests, but rather striving for ecological balance. It speaks to recognizing the value of the natural environment and the biodiversity, and not only its fundamental right to be there in its own, as itself, but also the way that our cultural systems, our spirituality, our foods also intertwine with that biodiversity around us. And then another very important part of agroecology is the right to have seed, to save seed, to exchange seed, and to sell our produce and our seed as part of our smallholder systems. And that's a right that's constantly under threat. In South Africa, it has been, and we're trying to eke out a space, but on the continent of Africa at the moment. Another way that the concept of food sovereignty and the mobilization of all these social movements around the world has come into international policy is in a fairly recent declaration called the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas. And just for all the English-speaking participants, peasants is not a derogatory term in this sense. It's the way that many of the social movements in West Africa, in Latin America, speak about people who are on the land. And so in this, peasants are including all the small-scale producers, people relying on family or household labor, anyone with this dependency on the land, so indigenous peoples, their dependents, and also indigenous communities and migrants and seasonal workers who rely on the land. And this is a really important document. It's not a treaty that's binding, legally binding, but it's a human rights instrument. So it has very high sort of overall significance. And that's really speaking to a whole lot of rights for people working on the land in rural areas. And those rights, as defined in this, include rights to seed, rights to biological diversity and knowledge, etc. So again, do go and have a look at that. And of course, food sovereignty and agroecology are also mentioned in that document. Then just food sovereignty is really an important campaign and objective, I think, for us, something we want to realize. But I thought to just also quote from scholar Raj Patel, who did a foreword to a book on food sovereignty, and he poses some interesting questions for us. So he says, and these are just quotes out of his essay, but to say that the modern food system, this food system that food sovereignty is trying to counter, has been architected by a handful of privileged people. And what food sovereignty insists is that this is illegitimate, because the design of our social system is not the privilege of the few, but the right of all. And fundamentally, that's what food sovereignty is trying to achieve. It demands that rights must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. But he also notes, with a little bit of skepticism, that at the end of the day, food sovereignty is about democracy, and that one can't have these conversations about rights and about food sovereignty if there isn't this underlying, you can't talk about food sovereignty if these underlying rights are not met, and that we don't have proper democracy, like a real egalitarian society at the base of that. And then just to end off, because we're talking about climate change, and I think, despite all this mobilizing and all this lobbying, the global food system is still dominated very much by corporations. And we still have this very negatively impacting global food system that dominates. And what the IPCC has started talking about very recently was the impact of the food system as a whole, not looking just at farming impacts, but the whole food value chain, so-called value chain in the industrial system. And really, if one looks at the food system as a whole, 1/3 of all climate greenhouse gases come from the food system, if you look at all the parts of it. And why this is this huge value, this huge global value chain, so-called value chain, because it's just a chain of production that moves food from one place to another around the world, and where that whole chain of industrial production is increasingly dominated by hidden digitalization, which is also very energy consuming, but also all these corporations that control parts of it and are increasingly controlling that whole industrial chain, especially, and the data that drives it behind it. So just for more information, because the time's short, please do look at some of our resources on our website. Recently, a fact sheet on climate change and the industrialized food system, what we're trying to avoid, and agroecology as an alternative for food sovereignty to that. And also a book we released this year, speaking of stories of resilience, learning from the farmers that we work with who were resilient not only in KZN where we've had a series of difficult crises, starting with a drought, then became flooding, then we had COVID, and we've also had social unrest, very bad social unrest in the province at the time, in just after the hard lockdowns. So this book speaks about how farmers through agroecology have been resilient to these upheavals that we've faced in our province. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was a really, really great presentation. Rogan, let's jump straight into yours and then we can do a discussion.
Thanks, Courtney, and thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Aurelie. Very interesting so far. I'm very fortunate in that I get to sort of maybe bring things back down to the ground, so to speak, and I've prepared a slightly more, hopefully, less traumatic presentation. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about practically how to start a food garden. And I think in terms of this whole climate reality and climate justice campaign, one of the things that we as individuals can do to disrupt that system is to obviously grow our own. And that's what I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about with you now. As mentioned, my name is Rogan Field. I am the Procurement Manager at Food and Trees for Africa, but at my heart, I am a farmer. And I think that's primarily the main point there. And in the next 20 minutes, I hope to give you just a very brief, albeit generic overview of how to start a food garden. I'd like to highlight some of the key points that you ought to consider before you maybe begin. Very importantly, farming is not easy. I think there's a misunderstanding there sometimes when we sort of begin and we try to implement food gardens. As much as every seed really wants to grow, and there's this sort of inherent ability for seeds to just grow, once you've planted them, they really require a lot of care and nurturing and work. So it's not as easy as putting a seed in the ground, but certainly it is something that we can do to help mitigate both climate change, become more secure, food secure for ourselves, and definitely within our communities. But like with any industry or any venture we go into, it's very important to always have a plan. And when one starts to think about their plan, I personally believe there are three main questions that we need to answer first. And I think this is very, very important. First question is, what do we want to achieve out of our, in this case, vegetable garden? Why do we want to do this? And how are we going to do it? And I've included three little examples here of how those answers might differ. So the first example I'd like to use is one of my own. I grow my own vegetables, and I have a mission. I want to grow enough fresh produce for me and my family so we no longer have to buy vegetables at a store. That's my goal, that's my objective. And the reason I want to do this is because I want to know where my food has come from, and I want to know how it was grown. How am I going to do this? Well, I'm going to learn as much as I can about the crops that I like to eat and make use of the available space in my garden to grow them. So I don't have much space, I'm limited by space, and I'm also limited by the things that I want. So these are the decisions that I'll use to inform my plan. If we were talking about a community garden, those answers might be slightly different. For example, we want to grow enough fresh produce for us and our families, and we would like to produce a sufficient surplus to sell in our local communities. The reason we want to do this is because fresh produce is sometimes hard to find in our community, and the way I'm going to learn to do this is to learn about the crops that are in demand, and together work communal land that we have access to. A market gardener may approach the same three questions in a slightly different way. I want to produce enough fresh produce to supply both my local community and make regular deliveries to a fresh produce market. The reason I want to do this is because I love farming and I want to make a career out of this. And my methods here are going to be to improve the knowledge I have already of the crops that I like growing and to expand my production in accordance with local market demands. And I think from that we can see there's quite clearly there's maybe three very different strategies that we might take before we do this. But once we have our rough idea, we can now legitimately start. And the first thing we're going to need to do is to choose a location. And you've heard it before, location, location, location. It does make a difference. So depending on where you are, is largely going to inform the type of crops you're going to be able to grow, as well as how much space you have is going to determine how much crops you can grow. So knowing what you want to achieve is going to help inform you as to how much land you may need. Alternatively, as is the case with me, I know how much land I have, and this will help to inform me as to what kind of level of production is possible. But some of the key points we'd need to consider when looking at our land is, firstly, we want to make sure that the land is secure. Security comes in many forms. Do you have the permission to occupy that land? Is it safe from the threat of animals coming in and eating your crops? Are there potentially human threats that may exist? So security is all encompassing. But generally speaking, you would like to make sure that your land is secure, particularly from things like goats and cattle and sheep. You need to have a fairly good understanding of the type of soil that you have present on that land. Is it sandy? Is it clay? Is it loamy? Is there a lot of silt in there? And what you need to do in order to improve your soil if it's not good enough as it stands. You'll need to have an understanding of the topography or the slope of the land, because that's going to impact how you design your garden. You want to know and have access to water and potentially power, depending on the level of production you want to get into. And then the direction of the wind and its intensity is also quite important to know. And possibly the most important thing is, do you receive sufficient sunlight? And for vegetable production, we like to have at least 6 hours of full sun per day for most vegetables. A couple of examples here just to demonstrate how farms may differ according to the land that you're on. In the first image, we see quite flat land where people are able to grow in very nice straight lines. And as we move across to the right, you see extremely sloped terraced gardens, making use of this sort of very difficult terrain. So now that you know where you want to do your vegetable garden, you need to create a map. And it might sound like a lot of planning, but my belief is really that the more we plan and the more we prepare for our garden, the better our results will be. And creating a map is a fantastic way to help you visualize your goals and solidify your plan. On your map, it's important to note factors such as slope, prevailing wind, water, and access points, because this will allow you to start planning where you're going to put things and how you might utilize the resources that you have. And obviously, very important, you want to consider the crops that you want to grow, investigate their specific requirements, and plan your production accordingly. So in these beginning stages, you're going to hear me repeat this over and over again. Plan, plan, plan. And unfortunately, every plan is different. There's no one size fits all, but I hope to cover some of the basics that will make it easier for you to then generate your own plans. The next thing we want to think about, obviously, is our crop selection. And again, it's really important that you understand the types of crops you want to grow, and your original goals will help you inform this decision. Some of the key questions I think we want to ask before we choose our crops will include, is this crop suited to my local climate conditions? Naturally, we can't grow, let's say, a pea in the middle of summer. We need sort of cold weather to do that, and so forth. Next question, is there a market for this crop? And the market can vary. In the case of my personal home garden, the market is myself and my family, and I have a very good understanding of what that market is. If you're selling in the local community, it's important that you're sort of tapping into what people like to eat. Do you want to grow cabbages or kale? Is okra perhaps a very popular crop? Tomatoes are generally well sought after, but they're a little bit more tricky. So there are a lot of questions you have to ask in terms of deciding which crops you want to grow. And then, of course, you need to know how much you must produce in order to supply this market. And again, it's relative to exactly what you're trying to do. So in my case, let's talk about cabbages, for example. We really like to eat cabbage at home, but generally one cabbage will last us a week or two. So I might want to farm 30 cabbages a year, and I will plan my production accordingly to make sure that I get the 30 cabbages that I eat per year, which is very different from a small community garden who may want to sell 100 cabbages a week. This will inform how you plan your production cycles and how you stage your production in order to meet that market in the most applicable way. And finally, how much space and how many plants will you need to achieve this? So what I'm hoping is you're starting to get an idea here of how important it is that you know each specific crop. And unfortunately, we don't have nearly enough time to go into any of this in detail. So I'm going to keep it very generic as we go. But importantly, you need to do your part. So research the crops that you want to grow and have a very good understanding of their requirements. For example, what is the optimal planting density and how long do they take to grow? What are the specific nutritional requirements and how much water does that particular crop need? And what is the expected yield and the expected market value of this crop? I think these are very important questions, because before you go into something, you need to have a good understanding of what you are hoping to achieve, both in terms of the food that you produce. But I think for most small market gardeners, the ultimate goal is to generate an income. So one needs to know how much money they can potentially earn and how to plan accordingly. I've produced a very nice sheet which we use with our projects, and this just gives a sort of indication of how you would do this. So there are a few things that we've covered now, and I think it summarizes them quite nicely. So we're going to need space, and here I'm calling it the total square meterage required for planting. We need to know how many plants would fit in every square meter, which will inform us the total number of plants we can have in a given space. Alternatively, we can calculate how many plants we would need to fill that space. So in this case, 10 square meters, relates to 120 beans, 325 beetroots, 60 broccolis, 8 butternuts, 50 cabbages, and so forth. So I think this gives you a very nice idea of how that can change. I have created this as a spreadsheet with the equations in it. So over here, you could simply say how many seedlings you would want to plant, and in turn, this will calculate how much land you would need, what your predicted yield would be, and an estimated income based on that number of plants. And I'm very happy to share this Excel spreadsheet. Obviously, this is designed for our projects here in South Africa, so that the prices may not be that relevant. And again, these documents are designed to be informed over time. So this would become a living document that you could update as your experience improves. But I will share this once we're done, and you're welcome to use it to help guide you in terms of calculating how many things you would need and the land required. The next thing we're going to want to consider is preparing the soil. Using that map you would have created, mark out the beds and the walkways, loosen the soil, remove your grass, weeds, rocks, and so on. The more time we spend here preparing our soil, the better the production will ultimately be. What you put in is what you get out. So once the soil is loose, add organic matter to the soil, such as compost, old manure. And at this point, you can also add organic fertilizers, things like bone meal, and any soil conditioners that you might want to use, such as effective microorganisms. At Food and Trees, we really do support organic farming entirely. And as much as we also promote the use of inputs such as fertilizers, pest controls, and so forth, it's important to remember that there are always alternatives. So, for example, checking the pH of your soil and amending if necessary. It may sound a little bit complicated, but getting some litmus paper to check your pH is not that tough. And generally what happens is soil pH tends to decrease over time as a natural process of decomposition. So as organic matter decomposes in your soil, it will naturally lower your pH. And a very good remedy to that is using things like wood ash from a fire in order to bring the pH back up. So they're often cheap alternatives that are readily available all around you that one can take advantage of. Once you've prepared your soil, cover that soil with a good mulch and give it a soak. A good tip here is to allow your soil now to recover for a couple of weeks before you plant. In that time, a lot of the weeds should germinate, and you can remove them before planting, which would also help control the weeds. Some simple organic amendments that you might find easily include compost, shredded tree bark, peat moss, manure, leaf mold, and wood ash. A quick note on mulching. I apologize if I'm going quickly, as you know, the time is quite limited. From my perspective, and I think what we've shown over 30 years of experience in community gardening, mulching is probably one of the most important things that we can do to improve our yield and production. And what it does is it protects the soil from the sunlight, which prevents the leaching and the loss of nutrients and minerals. So that's going to allow those nutrients and minerals to be available in the soil for the plants rather than being lost to the sun. It reduces evaporation, improving water retention and saving you money and water in the long term. It also promotes microbial activity in the soil and maintains a more stable soil temperature, which results in less shocking to the plants. It reduces weed, improves both the soil and the plant health, which ultimately produces better yields. And over time, it becomes compost through adding of these organic minerals to the soil, so reducing your input costs overall. So mulching is a very cheap and effective way of improving your production without having to spend a lot of money. Right, once we've done all of that, we can finally think about planting. And I think it's important that we've gone into this level of detail before we plant, because as I said, what you put in is what you get out. And the better we prepare, the better our crops will be. And when it comes to the crops, again, knowledge is power. Research the crops you intend to grow and make sure you have a really clear understanding of the plant density required. That's the number of plants per square meter. And I do realize there's a bit of repetition that is intentional. Knowing these things is absolutely imperative if you want to produce successfully. If you plant things too close together, they're not going to grow properly. If you plant them too far apart, you're wasting space and not getting the kind of production that you should. So plant density is vital. And as much as each crop may have a slight differences, this information is generally fairly easy to access through various platforms. And these days with the internet, we have a wonderful resource where we can find these sorts of specifics quite quickly and easily. Knowing the nutritional and the water requirements of each crop is also vital. Certain things require more water. Tomatoes, for example, need quite a bit of water, but they don't like the water on their leaves. So it's best to water tomatoes under the leaves without getting the leaves wet. This will reduce mold, it will reduce your likelihood of contracting blight, and you'll have better growth overall. Things like spinach, on the other hand, actually quite enjoy getting their leaves wet. So this would prefer an overhead sprinkling or overhead watering technique. And each crop is really different. So again, not enough time to go into it at a crop by crop level, but take the time before you start growing to research the crops so you have a very good understanding before you actually start. Knowing your expected yield and potential market value is critical to planning your operation, because no matter what size you do this, it's still a business. And even in the context of my small home garden, I'm going to be saving myself however many rands every month because I no longer have to spend that money in the store. So I'm still creating an income through my small backyard farm. And I think that applies. Knowing how many plants you need to plant and how often you will need to plant them is also vital. And I think a nice example here is, let's once again talk about a tomato. Tomatoes typically grow for a fairly long time, particularly if we're using an indeterminate variety, which would continue fruiting over an entire season. you might find that, so here in South Africa, we'll plant our tomatoes around about August, September. Hopefully we should be harvesting by November, December, and we should be able to continue harvesting off that same plant all the way through until April, May, possibly even the beginning of June, depending on where we are. A crop like beetroot, on the other hand, you would plant one beetroot and you would get one beetroot out. So you now need to decide how many beetroots you want to produce. If you need to produce 100 kilograms of beetroot a week, you would need to plant roughly 120 beetroots every week in order to one day meet that requirement. And finally, how do you intend to package and market your crops? And I think these are all things that you should have researched before you even start. Finally, you cannot manage what you don't measure. I love this saying because it is extremely true. And as a result, you need to keep records of everything. And I can't stress how important it is that you record what you do, when you did it, and what the result was. Because ultimately, we want to compare what we expected to happen versus what actually happened. And it's the constant improving of our knowledge through these records that will allow us to both gauge our progress and help us to make more informed decisions based on that real life experience as we go again. Some of the records we need to include are going to include what was planted, when it was planted, and how many. From that, we are able to determine expected harvest dates and estimate yields. What inputs did we use and what were the associated costs? How much was harvested versus sold? Ultimately, how much was sold and what did we get for it? And at the very end, what was my profit? Because that's what we're after. And how can I do better? And I hope that you start to see this sort of process of constantly learning and improving our decisions as we go. Which brings us eventually to actually growing the crops. And this is where the real hard work begins. Having that knowledge that you presumably have through all the research you've done, you would need to irrigate the crops according to their specific watering regimes, ensure there's sufficient nutrition in the soil for that particular crop. You need to implement some form of pest control and disease management strategy. Make sure that the gardens don't become overcrowded with weeds, and certain crops may require additional care through pruning and trellising in order to keep capacity. And record keeping is absolutely critical to all of this. At Food and Trees, and along with the ACRP, we've also produced a number of posters and various learning materials. And here are two examples of posters that we've released recently, both of which will be made available to all of you. Our production planning poster actually goes into a little bit more detail regarding specific densities for different types of crops, expected time to harvest, expected yields, and provides a little bit of information in terms of what some of the feeding requirements may be. And our companion planting poster gives a nice overview of which are good companions and how you can utilize other crops in your garden to help control pests and disease. Finally, we get to harvesting the fruits of our labor. And again, keeping records all the while that we do it, and bearing in mind that depending on who you are marketing to and what sort of market you have, this is going to inform how you present your crops. And it's great to have a good understanding of that as well. And finally, with preservation and some sort of processing, we're also able to increase the shelf life of our crops and add value. And learn from your experience, repeat. There's always more to learn, and there's always ways we can improve. And keeping those accurate records will help to identify what worked, what did not work. Very importantly, start small and grow bigger, setting realistic goals that you know you can achieve. And something I try to hold in my heart at all times is to enjoy the process. No matter what you do, it's a lot easier if you enjoy doing it. Thank you very much. I'm a few minutes over, but there we go. Back to you, Courtney.
Thanks, Rogan. Thank you so much for that presentation. I think it was very helpful to see, the practical things that we can do. And I hope that once we share with our participants, they can come back with some questions around their specific contexts. So we are running a bit over time, as we usually do in this space. But what we want to do now is just have a Q&A. We're going to have a 10-minute Q&A, and then we will move on to the next session. So if you have a question for either of our presentations, please put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and you will be able to ask your question. As I said, we are running over time, so please keep your questions short, and then so that we can allow time for responses from our speakers as well. Yeah, so if you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay, I don't see any questions. Team, were there any questions in the chat? I don't think so.
No, there was nothing.
Okay, just obviously requests to share, which we will definitely do. We'll share all of the presentations. Okay, I see a hand. Liozette.
Hi, my name is Liozette and I am from HSI Africa and the Green Monday program in South Africa. I just have a question for Vanessa. You spoke about our agriculture's impact on climate change, and you mentioned farming and food transportation and so forth, but not specifically animal agriculture. And I was wondering if Biowatch has a stance on animal agriculture. As you probably know, the FAO has stated that animal agriculture specifically is responsible for up to 16.5% of greenhouse gas emissions, or anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So I was wondering what you thought about the impact of animal agriculture specifically on climate change. Thank you.
Yeah. Should I answer now, or do you want to?
Yeah, there's another question.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. In South Africa's emissions, the animal side contributes 70% of the farm emissions. Obviously, also because a lot of our meat is coming from industrialized farming, so it's factory farmed animals. But there's another side to it, and from an agroecology perspective, animals are a very key part of the system for producing nutrients. And I think it's with all kinds of things. When one starts to industrialize and squash animals in, and then have waste that a lot of the factory farms create a lot of waste that's not integrated back into the soil. They become like slimes, dams of waste, and that creates methane, which also adds to the emissions. So yeah, it's about the whole way that we produce food. But if we can go to a more integrated food production system where animals are a part of it, and the waste is going back into the land and fertilizing the land, it's slightly different. But of course, then we also have the downside in South Africa where we have livestock that's not well managed because of the sort of disruption of cultural systems of livestock management. And then you've got erosion related to that, which contributes to the problems, and the problems when you've got heavy rains, etc. So I think with everything, it's got to be an integrated approach, and one has to not be having intensive anything, like no monocrops. It's about integrated systems, and then also more diverse food systems, and also more diverse food habits. And I think that's also been a part of the industrialization, is this constant barrage of advertising, getting us to eat unhealthy processed foods, getting us to eat a few things that, you know, that don't have good nutrients in. It's the whole globalization of agriculture has been based on a few commodity crops that are grown very intensively over whole countries sometimes. Like if you look at Latin America and what we call the soya republics, because genetically modified soya has taken over the land, and all for export to Europe for animal agriculture. So it's the whole thing's out of balance. And how do we get back control, get back to eating culturally appropriate food, diverse food that's good for us and also the world that we live in?
Can I add something there? I think what's so important out of this is, firstly, I think, unfortunately, because I enjoy my meat, but I'm very aware, as I'm sure so many of you are, that one of the most important things we can do as individuals to help mitigate climate change is to actually eat less meat. And what's really scary is if you look at commercial agriculture, the percentage of crops grown purely for the production of animal feed. I don't know the percentages at all. Perhaps you might have some idea there, Vanessa, but as far as I understand, it's more than 50% of commercial agriculture goes into feed production for animals. So not only are the animals themselves producing methane gas and potentially degrading the soil and damaging the land in terms of sort of deforestation and erosion and whatnot, but a lot of the space that we use to grow crops, which could be used to grow food for humans, is going to animal production. Scarily, even when we look at harvesting the sea and the amount of fish that we harvest, again, it's more than 50 or 60% of all fish that's harvested goes into the production of fish meal to be used in animal feed again. So it's not that we don't have enough food, it's just that our food is poorly distributed and poorly used. I think that's very important to mention.
Thanks, Rogan, for that input. I think it's a big debate. It's one of the biggest debates in the climate space. But I think just to reiterate, and also ACRP's position, it's really about our consumption levels, and really, talking about, climate change as a capitalist issue and not necessarily being prescriptive about people's diets. And it's really about, people eating more culturally appropriate foods. We have communities who have had meat and fish integrate into their diets for as long as history, but they've done so in an integrated manner, and not, through this mass-produced commercial system. So I think really at the crux of food sovereignty is owning systems, and it's about the system of how our food is managed. So yeah, thanks for those inputs. We are running out of time, so I'm going to just take these 3 questions from Smith, because those are the only ones I see in the chat. And then we can move on to our next session. So the first question is, I'm losing it now. First question was directed at me. How do we truly adapt or mitigate climate change in the African context? In this era of climate finance, what are your thoughts around climate funding? And I didn't really focus on that in my presentation. The second question is to, I assume, Vanessa. Is food sovereignty attainable owing to the consistent impact of climate change? So I think specifically in our context where we are experiencing the impacts, can we truly achieve food sovereignty? And then lastly to Rogan, how do you expand food gardening and make it a culture for young people and young Africans? I'm going to give you each a chance to respond to those questions. First, I'll respond to the question that's directed to me. I think it's really important to understand that many of the countries across Africa have not had a significant contribution to climate change. However, we are experiencing the impact and we need to adapt, right? but we can't speak about climate action without speaking about climate finance. So we have an entire campaign on climate finance. So I could spend a whole other webinar talking about it, which was not the objective of this particular webinar. So Smith, if you are interested in climate finance, you can definitely drop us an email and we can share some tools with you. But essentially, as the ACRP, we recognize that we need climate action, and we have to speak about climate action in the African context related to climate finance. And when we talk about climate finance, we are really pushing for finance that is centered on justice, which means grant financing. We know that there is a historical inequality when it comes to financing, when it comes to contributions to climate change. And so we really focus on this idea that we should be getting grant financing for this. We should not be locked into a debt cycle as Africans, just to enable us to adapt and to mitigate. The mitigation question is a big one, because of course, many African countries have challenges with energy access. So the mitigation aspect in Africa is not necessarily about that shift, but it's really about leapfrogging. And what that means is that we can skip some of the very harmful industries and go straight to renewable energy sources. And then lastly, just to say, obviously, for South Africa, we do have a dual experience of being very vulnerable and not having adaptive capacity, but also having a massive responsibility. We are one of the highest emitters in the world. And on the African continent, South Africa does have a responsibility to mitigate. So I think we must always remember that nuance. And in terms of climate finance, yeah, I can definitely share some resources around fair financing. But I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand over to Vanessa to answer that question.
Thanks. Yeah, there's many aspects to it. I think that obviously, if we totally localizing our food system, we might have difficulties with the impacts of climate change, such as we've had in KZN. So if you have a catastrophic climate event, like the kinds of flooding we had, and your whole production system is washed away, then you do have a problem. But at the same time, and that's why I put that new publication of ours in, that's the agroecological methods of growing have soil health built into them. So you're improving the soil health so the soil can absorb more water. It doesn't wash away as easily when there is heavy rain. We have water conservation, swales and those kinds of things built into the production systems. The traditional crops are much more resilient as well to different kinds of weather, so they can manage with extremes of heat and then too much wet, and they sort of recover much more easily. So there's all those ways that agroecology is much more resilient. And so what we're saying is, let's localize, so not like to the very, very local, but at least regionally, or in districts, one can localize one's food system. And if you've got enough small producers doing diverse production, you've got a lot of food to share, exchange, sell, and get diversity. I think that there's a misconception that we need that global food system, because otherwise we won't be able to feed ourselves and we'll be food insecure. But what COVID's shown us, what the Ukraine war has shown us, is how very vulnerable that global system is, because everything's centralized. So if you have a problem with one of those big producers or those central distribution places, then you all sit without food. Whereas if you've got a very strong regional network of many, many small producers all contributing, it's like a spider's web that's got all that strength in it because it's got so many strands. So it's about us getting out of this brainwashing that we have from the industrialized food system that keeps telling us, oh, we need it to feed the world. We're all going to starve if we don't have it. It's not true. We have to rethink how we do it, especially under climate change. So I think we just need to change changed our thinking, and hopefully that's also answered a little bit about the question on agroecology, which is really about diversity, reviving lost crops and what's so-called underutilized crops. It's such a horrible term, but those resilient, diverse foods that people used to eat that we're just not eating anymore, because we look down on the wild plants. We say, oh, you're too poor if you harvest the wild greens, or we herbicide them out of our production. There's so many things that can contribute to healthy, diverse diets that we miss out on nowadays because of going into this globalized diet that's based on a few commodities. Thanks.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, Vanessa. Rogan, can you give us a quick 1-minute response? So we can.
Very quick. Yes, I can. So I think the first trick to expanding agriculture, particularly amongst the youth, is for us to regain this idea that farming is actually cool. It's fun. We need to make it attractive. We need to make it appealing. And that's how we're going to attract the youth to agriculture. And as much as in a lot of these sort of talks, we sort of talk a little bit about almost going back to old knowledge, where we were more of an agricultural being at our core. We would have grown our own food, we would have been hunter-gatherers and slowly domesticated various plants for propagation. And it's likely that most people were experts in farming 200 years ago. And as we became more and more dependent on other people to grow our food for us, we've almost lost this knowledge. But on the flip side of that, we've also moved forward in terms of technology. And I think technology is also going to play a huge role in all of this, where we utilize technology and take advantage of technology, because it's not inherently bad, the technology itself. And things like surveillance with drones to look at your fields, the cool kind of computer modeling programs that have come out for agriculture and things that we can do to help us, I think, appeal to the youth and appeal to the more technical minded youth of today. And that for me is definitely one way we can make farming more attractive, but also at that small scale. And otherwise, I think, Smith, the trick is you need to obviously start small and be good at what you do. And if you're successful on 100 square meters, find another 100 square meters and become successful at that. Once those 200 square meters are successful, open up another 100 squares. And I think the biggest trick to expanding is to not do it too quickly. A lot of, we've noticed on a lot of our projects, particularly the biggest projects, there's often an overinvestment in terms of how much land is prepared, and then they're unable to sort of keep up with the watering and the weeding and the actual maintenance of those plants. So it's really important that you start at a level which is manageable, and then allow the expansion to happen naturally in accordance to the markets that you open up for yourself. And this, again, will also happen naturally. We always used to say when we were farming, the three magic things you want is consistency, quality, and quantity. And you need to get all of those right. So you want to produce a consistent quality of a given number over time. And you can, once you've got the consistency and the quality down, you can start working on increasing your quantity.
Thank you, Rogan. And thank you once again to Vanessa and Rogan for your presentations. We will share them with the participants. We really, really appreciate your inputs. They were really helpful. And we are now going to hand over to Zianda for her session. Yeah, handing over to you. Thanks, Rogan and Vanessa.
Thanks, guys. We are almost at the end, but just to take you through the section, which we as ACRP call the art reflection section. And thanks, Quartz. Sorry, I forgot I even had slides. And basically this part of the workshop is about, taking a moment to regroup, take in what you've learned from the Climate 101 part of the workshop, the food sovereignty part, and, just the climate crisis in general. As explained by Courtney, climate change is a massive issue. And it causes, quite a lot of despair and fear if not unpacked and reflected on properly. The information that you see, read, or learn about, it can be quite overwhelming, resulting in emotions being all over the place or towards issues such as eco-anxiety. Therefore, basically, this section will talk through, various ways in which a person can process, information in a positive way, being mindful of your feelings and, just reflecting through your thoughts and emotions. As said, we know climate change can be quite a, deeply emotional issue to talk about. Threats to life and historical inequality can lead us here, can be quite upsetting. So taking time to practice mindfulness can provide you with tools on how to, choose on how to react in a more healthy manner is important. And one of those ways is through breathing. Courtney, if you can just go to the next slide. Is through breathing, just, taking a sit back, doing a breathing exercise. This is just one of many methods a person can do just to, feel themselves both emotionally and, physically. Usually what we say is we can't have activists operating in like a autopilot state of mind. Therefore, it's quite important to just, take a moment and get away and recognizes what makes you feel overwhelmed is quite important. Yes, breathing like yoga, as Smith is saying in the chat. But not only through those means, there is other ways to reflect. And one of them, or several ways, is through, art. There's a variety of definitions when it comes to this term, but how ACRP basically resonates with this term is it's about tapping and communicating lived experiences, clarifying what you're thinking, or just simply taking a moment to really reflect on what matters to us. Sometimes we do find it quite difficult to, express yourselves through spoken word. And all a person just wants to do is to, channel the experiences, feelings, and emotions in a different form. So various ways include your illustrations, your paintings, your documentaries, journaling, song composing, or even, a dance. Are just, several creative methods or outlets that can assist a person in processing difficult and heavy information. Art in general is just a great way to convey a message that brings about hope, love, and some form of optimism towards, dealing with the climate crisis, or in general, any other issue a person may be facing. Here at ACRP, we do this reflection in, through various ways, one of them being documentaries. As some of you have seen, They're Not on Our Soil and Our African Voices for Africa's Forest. It's one of the means in which we communicate or reflect experiences, but also we do it through, visual and written art. So the next couple of slides, or the slides that Courtney is currently showing, is one way in which a person can express themselves is through poetry. These poems are basically derived from our campaign that we did last year in collaboration with, Philippines branch and Canada branch, which people or climate leaders in this particular case spoke through or wrote about specific biomes that they resonate with. Next slide, Courtney. Other ways, this is just another example of a poem that was written by another climate leader, but other ways is through visual arts, through a painting. So last year as well, part of the Win Is Now campaign, which I'm happy to share more details about it on a later on stage, or reach out to me to know more about it. We created visual arts, which were murals, which were basically derived from the poetry that people had, written about all over the world. So here in South Africa, we have one in Kensington. So if you do have South African climate leaders that are around, please do check it out, share a picture, share it with us. But also we did create one in Zambia and in other countries, as I said, in collaboration with other branches. We created some in Canada and Philippines. So I don't know if Courtney, you want to share visual arts. Next slide on that. So these are just, creative ways in which a person or you as a community, can come together, create a visual representation of whatever issue that you may feel needs to be communicated other than just in a written or spoken manner. And you can do it in a form of a poetry, in a form of visual art as well, such as these kind of examples. But because we're running out of time as well, I would like to just encourage you for about 5 minutes. Prior, I did make a request to you guys to please have like a pen and paper next to you. But basically, I would like for your guys or for the participants in this call to just take 5 minutes. We'll play music in the background to create your own sprout of, creative climate action by either writing a poem. It doesn't need to be a lot. It can be 4 or 5 lines, paper poem, or you just use a word to express what you're currently feeling or going through. And for those who would like to share afterwards, please do, but there's no pressure in doing so. So if you can, please, just for 5 minutes, quickly do that. So actually, because of time, I don't think that section will be possible to do because we are running out of time. But what we can do is, when it comes to that, please do create some form of artwork or a poem on how you're feeling in today's, session, how you felt the outcome of the session was, or how you feel with the information that you've received. Do you feel overwhelmed? Do you feel excited? Do you feel, or just with your community as well, come up with a poem, and please do share those with me. We are trying to collect stories of people's lived experiences or how people feel that we could share on, greater and wider platforms. But because of time, I will cut out that session, unfortunately. I will pass it on to you already.
Thank you so much, Z. Yeah, I'm so sorry we ran out of time. We really do enjoy our creative reflections sessions, but as you said, we really do encourage you to pen your reflections down. It can be a word, a picture, a poem, anything really. And yeah, and just feel free to send that to us, as we collect all of these different expressions, reflections, and stories. But essentially, that brings us to the end of our very first installment of the African Voices Workshop series. A very big thank you to Vanessa and Rogan for bringing your expert knowledge to the space. It really was invaluable information that you shared with us. To all of you who joined, I'd also like to thank you for participating. And I really do encourage you to take everything you've learned here back into your spaces, your communities, and encourage active citizenry. Thank you as well to my team, Courtney, for that Climate 101 presentation, Zianda for the art reflections. Thank you very much for that. And to those who are asking if we'll be sending these slides, we definitely will, as well as the recording of this session. You'll get that. And I'd also like to invite you all to our other 2 sessions on water and waste. We'll be talking water security on the 21st of July and waste management on the 18th of July. We will send you updates, and we'll also keep reminding you on social media. You'll all be receiving some feedback forms from Zianda in the course of the week. Please fill those out and send it back to us. It's very important that we hear from you and how you enjoyed these workshops to really make an impact with these workshops. And as I said earlier, for our climate reality leaders, I would make you aware of an opportunity that we have for you. So there is an opportunity for you to receive a grant from a CRP to run and implement an adaptation project in your own community. So it could be a food garden, as Rogan has just, taught us how to implement, or something that's got to do with waste management or water security, which you'll learn about in the other workshops. But it's open only to CRL, but only CRL who attend all 3 workshops, who share an art reflection with us, and as well as send back feedback forms. So the CRLs who do that will receive details on how to apply for the grant. And if you have any questions on that process, on this process, the CRL process, the grant process, please reach out to Zianda as your contact person, and she will clarify everything. And for those of you who want to join our Climate Leader Network to become a CRL, there'll be a training in Africa this year. It's likely to be around West Africa. Our founder, former US Vice President Al Gore, will be giving his training at this workshop. Details of that are available on our website. You'll see there's the Africa training tab right at the top. You can click on that for more information. Otherwise, that's it from me. Thank you all so much for joining. If you could just switch on your cameras maybe, so we can, just take a picture of everyone who is here, so we can post it on our social media platforms, if you don't mind. Zianda, will you take the photo?
I'm happy to, but just a quick one from Courtney. How do I make it a grid for everyone's face to show? Because currently they're showing in a line. So if you can just get help with that, then I'll take the picture.
So in the top right corner, it will say view, and you can change it to gallery view.
Okay, I'm happy. Thank you. So put on your best smiles, pause, fix your hair, show teeth, Once you're ready, I'll take the picture. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zianda. Thank you all once again for joining. Feel free to unmute yourselves and say goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful time. Good luck
Thanks,
farming.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.